Hi, everyone. My name is Fiona Flaherty. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Welcome to what I'm sure will be a very engaging conversation here at Dominic Chambers' solo show, Leave Room for the Wind. I have the pleasure of working with Dominic here at Lehmann Maupin, and it's been very exciting to have this as his first debut major show with us in New York. I'm excited to introduce Dominic Chambers, the artist, as well as Jenée-Daria Strand, who's an assistant curator at the Public Art Fund, and I hope everybody enjoys the evening. Dominic's show here is on view through this Saturday, and his solo exhibition at the Contemporary Art Museum of St. Louis, titled Birthplace, is on view through February 11th. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to them.
Thank you, Fiona.
Thanks, Fiona.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. As Fiona said, my name is Jenée-Daria Strand, Assistant Curator at Public Art Fund, and I have the pleasure of being in conversation with Dominic. I have seen your work both on the interwebs and in real life for quite some time, and have been a fan from afar, and when we had our conversation in the studio, it felt like the catalyst to exactly this moment. So thank you for inviting me to continue the conversation with you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And also, thank you to all of you who have come out tonight. It's, I'm not gonna pretend to be cool right now. It looks fucking amazing. It's so good to see all of you. And I mean that sincerely. And Jenée, of course, it's always a pleasure speaking with you. And I hope that you guys, whenever Jenée and I speak, I hope you guys are willing to extend a bit more time to us because we tend to have very lively conversations. And so, of course, my optimism and enthusiasm, which is clearly present right now, is only amplified by all of the faces I see here. And so, we're gonna have this discussion, and we'll leave room for questions and answer, or Q&A afterwards. And I'm very much an open book, so if most of this conversation we have, I don't know if it'll entirely be centered around the work, but a lot of the ideas, which is the territory I find really exciting for she and I to discuss, will be discussed here tonight. And so if you guys have a question about a particular artwork, feel free to ask at your leisure, but keep in mind that it may not be acknowledged in the conversation we'll have. So I'll leave with that.
Amazing.
Okay.
So let's start with the context of the work, because you created this body of work with Mary Oliver's The Leaf in the Cloud, her book-long poem at the fore of your mind when you were creating. And so just to ground us in this conversation, can you give us context into the work? What is the book about? And what was so impactful about the book that led you to this beautiful result?
And can everyone hear me just fine? I noticed some people are still coming in. We're all good? Fantastic. So, as Jenée outlined, the title of the exhibition, Leave Room for the Wind, is borrowed from an excerpt in a book-long poem called The Leaf in the Cloud, which I have with me. Yes, I'll be reading from it. But for those of you who are unfamiliar with Mary Oliver's work, much of her poetry centers around this idea of intent observation, on the poetics that are provided to you when you engage with a space of observation that's quite intentional. In her words, she views it as viewing the world with passion. And in doing so, not only do you create the opportunity to, replenish your interior resources, meaning your imaginative resources, your creative resources, and the things that kind of keep your creative practices, flowing, but also in the critical labor of what it means to work. And so, in this book, The Leaf in the Cloud, I wanted to read a particular passage out of this book that I think will help give a foundation of sorts for us to have a conversation on. Because there's a couple ideas in this particular passage that I think will give a key chart in a way when it comes to interpreting the images that I decided to invest my time into. And so if you guys are here with me and you have a couple minutes, we're gonna read Work, which is a part of The Leaf in the Cloud, which is the book-long poem under which the exhibition is named. Okay. The Leaf in the Cloud by Mary Oliver. Work. I am a woman, 60 years old, and of no special courage. Every day, a little conversation with God, or his envoy, the tall pine, or the grass-swimming cricket. Every day, I study the difference between water and stone. Every day, I stare at the world. I push the grass aside and stare at the world. I spring, pickled in the burn and shine of the tight, packed water, the sweetness of the child on the shore, also its radiant temper, the snail climbing the morning glories, carrying his heavy will, the green throat of the lilies turning from the wind. This is the world. Comes the hunter under the red leaves, come the hounds on their stubbies. Like when they pour through the grass, like when they pour up the hill, like when they twist and swirl in the long grass. Every day, I have work to do. I feel my body rising through the water, not much more than a leaf. And I feel like the child, crazed by beauty or filled to bursting with woe. And I am the snail in the universe of the leaves, trudging upward. And I am the pale lily who believes in God, though she has no word for it. And I am the hunter, and I am the hounds, and I am the fox. And I am the weeds of the field, and I am the tunnel of the coolness under the earth. And I am the paw print in the dust. I am the dusty toad who looks up, unblinking, and sees, do you also see them? The white clouds in their blind, round-shouldered haste. I am a woman, 60 years old, and glory is my work. And so this particular poem in this section on work is quite essential to understanding how it is that I think through this work and how my imagination functions when I imagine the landscape of leisure and the landscape of work, creative work in particular. And so if we were to look at this book, The Leaf in the Cloud, and were to acknowledge it as an observation of, both the heavens and the earth, our relationship to those forces outside of our control, the role of nature, and also the things that are quite familiar to us, like the place of grass and the life of trees in our community. And she emphasizes that there is a certain type of work, right? Like every day I have work to do, as being an essential element to this type of encounter or this engagement with the world around us. And that, for me, was the jumping off part for this particular body of work for myself, like a type of imagining that takes leisure into a space of observation. For many of you who are, avid art viewers and art lovers, you oftentimes engage with an art painting through what some would consider to be active looking, and from what many painters would assume to be a type of witnessing, right? Like with the expectations around witnessing an art object, there's an expectation for you to recall what it was that you saw. And so there's a hypersensitivity to this act of engaging with, an art object, but by Mary Oliver's extension, the world around you, the world in which we live. And so to take that a point further, if you allow me, Jenée, because I think it's important for understanding how I think about the process of painting with this work as well. So I read, of course, Mary Oliver, and I became really obsessed with her relationship to the world. And she became, in a lot of ways, like this type of shadow companion for me, right? Like something that I could call onto, or a voice that could be a compass or a guiding voice for me throughout a particular idea or a body of work. And that's pretty consistent, what I would imagine to be like my entire kind of trajectory as an artist, basing all the way back to me graduating from grad school. But anyway, one of the things I do most often in my studio practice that I tend to listen to lectures around leisure. I saw a friend in the crowd. It totally caught me off guard. It surprised me. And so one of the things I do most often is that I tend to listen to lectures a lot because it helps me understand how an artist or a thinker kind of navigates an idea, right? Because I wonder whether or not they're in conversation with a particular concern the same way, in the same metric that I am. And so Mary Oliver once was in this podcast called On Being. And are you familiar? Are you familiar with it, right? Yeah. It's a fucking great podcast. You should check this out because Mary Oliver she's an extraordinary introvert. And so she didn't really spend a whole lot of time doing interviews. And so this is one of the rare occasions in which we got to witness her do so. And so during her discussion with Krista, she talked about this type of criticism. And again, this goes back to the poem here. That her editor gave her when he saw the type of framing she utilized for her poetry, and that she utilized the individual I a lot, meaning the self. So every day I have work to do. And the editor was like, oh, that seems overly self-indulgent. Like, I don't know if that's the way you want to go. This is a place of like, this is not critical enough for the type of work we want to do. And for Mary Oliver, her commitment to standing on that stone and saying that the eye is useful because the eye is the possible reader was significant, right? And because when you recite a poem, and this goes back to a conversation you and I were having about this idea of the book-long poem, what Mary Oliver does is that she breaks it up into a piece that we can consume. And so the I becomes you, like when every day I have work to do. You, the individual reading the subject, has work to do.
Yeah, it's a proclamation in that sense.
In that sense, right? But it's also a prayer.
Exactly.
Right? It's also something that you have and you can recite to oneself, something that you can carry. And if we think about like the function or the role of prayer in work, and I mean that for like creative work or any type of work really, you imagine a prayer that's like a request, right? Like you'll get on your knees and you'll ask for something, ask for guidance or as a point of desire. But like the function of a prayer is also a recall, right? A type of returning to. And like that for me is also the role of painting, right? Like the idea of like recalling a particular history of painting, a particular mode of painting, a linguistic catalog of different voices who operated in a space of painting that you found quite useful. And so all of those types of concerns and this idea of thinking about the art object as a vehicle for not only time travel, but as a means to also acknowledge those types of activities that are quite ubiquitous, but we are impressed by in all times, but also the poetry that's in those type of things.
And as you are reading, it sparks for me the requirement of prayer, that it is a slow practice, it's a meditative practice, and it's one that really requires you to sink into your body in order to both experience, offer, and receive.
Yeah.
And so when you link that to slow looking, when you link that to the language of leisure, both in creation, in reception, in witnessing, I think about the cadence of your reading in relation to the slowness of looking and witnessing your work. And so I would love to hear you talk more about how the slowness and what a book length or book long poem requires of you also translates to the slowness in which the viewer is receiving the reception of your work.
Yeah, I like that.
Timing and pace, I think, is my question.
Yeah, timing and pace. And it's so funny because I feel like our definitions of timing is so like impoverished today. Like we never seem to have enough time. So I'm like, oh, that's a thing. But I think the idea of a book-long poem, I think about it in a lot of ways the same way I think about it in atlas. Like if we are familiar with what an atlas is, it's a catalog for a map, right? Meaning that it helps you find your direction through a particular landscape or an environment or a place in geography. The atlas that books, in a lot of ways, and in particular, like poetry, offered for me was an atlas through a space of ideas. And that, for me, is, for those who understand or like who live and work with artists, you understand how solitary of creatures we are. And so it's important to understand that we oftentimes look for means to be in dialogue, right? To be in conversation with people, to find a guiding compass to a particular space. And so when it comes to me, my attention span is not as good. It's not as good as it used to be, honestly. And so, when I'm reading, I think about it the way I think about a conversation, And so it's not. I don't read nowadays with the expectation I will consume and understand everything, right? So that is to say, I return to a lot of passages a lot. And I think that's absolutely necessary, considering the war on our attention span that we're all currently under. But when it comes to the idea of looking, I think I'm someone who looks very swiftly at something, and then I try to look at things slowly in the holistic nature of, and that comes, I think that keeps me healthy in the process of making work. I think about Alex Tass a lot, and he thinks about the idea of thinking about something like a quick light. Meaning that it's something that happens and almost captures your attention very immediately. Meaning that you're witnessing something of consequence, something that's happening in that moment. And he found himself in contrast impressionist painters because they were very dependent on slow light. Meaning that when I was looking at a Monet haystack, I'm meaning to understand that painting as taking place over a cumulative amount of hours. I don't want that expectation from my work, I don't know if I necessarily feel that way about this expectation around the type of looking. I do require it to be a kind of a conversing that happens between you and the image through an observational offering that you offer to the image. But I also think it as a vehicle for time travel. That meaning that like poetry, if it becomes something that you can take with you, the image also has that role for us. There are certain paintings in my mind, in my memories catalog that I know I can think about them when I need them, right? Like if we were to think about someone like a Kerry James Marshall, I'm sure many people in our minds could imagine what one of those paintings looked like at some point. So in that way, it's something that it doesn't just stay in the gallery or the museum, right? It literally enters into your life. Becomes a part of your kind of memories catalog in a way. And so I hope that my images have that type of impact. I don't have the expectation that you would spend 5 to 10 or even 20 minutes in a room with something that I made, but hopefully you walk with it outside of this space. That's the goal. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
I don't know if that makes any sense.
It makes perfect sense. And it sounds like you're saying that even in the quickness of witnessing, that there's so much to receive and walk away with.
Oh, absolutely. And so much that you don't understand. That's what's so, I think, so interesting about art objects. There are paintings here that I don't fully understand. I take Ophelia, for example, or even Rosalind. And I came here to the gallery earlier on before all of you were here. I came because I just wanted to spend time with them, and I don't know what their surface nature is 100% like, right? I can't read it like the back of my hand as I could with some paintings that are still in my, my studio. And so for me, building this kind of visual relationship and cementing them in a space of my consciousness was important, because then I can kind of give them the attention for why it is that they're here, what it is they have to say. There are paintings that I remember encountering, I didn't understand what it was that you were trying to tell me. They were just happy to exist. And that for me is an interesting thing or interesting point of negotiation with an art object,
And I think what you do so well also is a negotiation between what is real, what is not, what is familiar, what is not, but also through scale, you are enabling us to witness ourselves within the work. And I think about that in the conversation that we've had before, which is when you really study each of the images, the bodies are so much larger than the landscape. And so this question of possibility and impossibility comes up for me. Another question that comes up for me is in seeing my body in relation to another body that's almost in proximity to me, that's almost childlike but familiar, but it could almost be real. I'm then imagining myself within it, and imagining, could this world also exist in the world that I currently exist in? So I would love to hear you talk about the ways in which your work, through scale, through proportion, acts as a portal for constant imagining, both real and otherwise.
Yeah. I think the idea of scale is important with his works. They are quite large. And y'all should have seen getting these out of my studio. It was, I really did not prepare for that. I prepared for their height, not their length. But to this idea of scale. So I remember when I was an undergrad, and I believe you can correct me if I was wrong, but I believe it was maybe the year 2016 where Kerry James Marshall's Mastery exhibition first took off at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. So I'm not sure if that's the exact year, but anyway, when I went there, I remember walking through the main hall into the space and being completely surrounded by his garden project series. And those paintings are they're huge, they're gigantic paintings. And I remember feeling as though I walked into, first, I remember thinking, man, this man, really loves us. He, really loves Black people, right? So, he does. He totally loves us. And it's amazing because you see what his kind of, critical in our historical investments were, right? To display paintings at a scale that you could not simply deny them or to walk past them or to ignore the kind of skill. And this, again, goes back to Mary Oliver as she talks about the type of writers like a Walt Whitman that became her companion. And the writers that she returned to is that it's not enough for you to just simply appreciate these as good images and assume that we all can make them. But you understood that there was a certain type of skill that was required. And that was something I think Kerry was quite in tune to, right? When he thought about the art historical tradition that he wanted to be, not necessarily in opposition to, but a part of, right? Recognize there was a certain type of skill required. And so for me, this idea of creating like a painting of a particular scale, of a grand scale, not only spoke to that type of investment, meaning that it was a painting that announced itself in a space, but also they're like long ass landscapes. Like if you walk past one of these paintings, it tends to stay with you, right? Because it blinds your sense of vision. And so if you were to walk past one of these paintings, like you're still within it for maybe like 5 or 6 or 8 steps at least, right? And so for me, like I found that really poetic. I mean, you know, in that moment, that painting became my world. You know, it became my backdrop. It became something that I existed within, that I found my body in relationship to. And that was what was so crazy about that mastery exhibition. Like when you walk through all of those paintings, you understood that I was for sure in his domain, right? His concerns, his interests, his investments, and the skill that he took and the care that he took in making sure that they were presented well, you know? And for me as a viewer, I remember taking that with me. You know, I can't remember what all of them look like definitely like 3 for sure, but there were others, but I remember what they made me feel. And I remember like feeling, oh, I wanted to compose something of that scale, of that type of power. And I'm not saying that these works are of that type of metric by any means, you know, not to be like hubris, but that's like, you know, that's the goal, right? Like that's what we want to do in service of our community, to present things powerfully and at a scale. And it, you know, it's something that those who come to engage with our work have the capacity to take with them. And so that's what I think about a lot when I think about scale. But yeah, I mean, but also like the scale of this work lends itself to the activities happening within the images. Like it's, of course, they're all flying kites here, right? And so if we were to talk about like this interest in kites, so if individuals were aware of the type of work I was making earlier on, and it had a lot to do with representation of like the Black body in moments of leisure, but oftentimes it was like the Black subject was accompanied by a book. And so for me, it was always this idea that there was a particular object that operated in a way that could be transformative for you, meaning that there was a synchronous relationship between the activity that you were engaging in and your imagination, right? And those two in harmony have the capacity to influence the rational world, right? That's where my love for magical realism kicked in. And so if we were to think about that in a sense that the idea of leisure could graduate into a more kinetic leisure or an active type of leisure, but still having that type of force, what would it look like? And for me, like kite flying was the most effective one. And it was because, like in the role of painting, like a kite is just a mark, you know, it's a flat sheet of color that can occupy space. But that's also what it is in real life. Like if I was to tell all of you to go paint the sky for me, you know, those of you who get like an easel and a brush and go do it, like good for you, but I'm probably gonna go view the kids who are flying kites in the sky, because that's what they're doing. They're just applying, you know, these colors or these sheets of colors to the environment that they live in. And so for me, like that type of activity and the idea that the kite could then again, you know, reunite your mind with the sky, you know, or this thing that ascends beyond the self, could also act as a generating force for the imagination and as a reservoir to like replenish that interior landscape that writers like Tracy K. Smith or Mary Oliver or Ocean Vuong or John O'Donohue, the things that they are invested in. There's activities like painting that can get you there, you know? So I think about that a lot too.
There's so much within that, because when I think about the language of your domestic interior, it's not an enclosed space at all. It's not an inaccessible space at all. It actually looks quite vast and it looks quite open. There's also the point at which you mentioned in your earlier work, a lot of the figures were reading or engaging in literary text, but visually. And so it's interesting to see your work now have the literary text still present, but as an undercurrent, an underbody to the work.
Yeah, it becomes like an apparatus
exactly.
almost, right? As opposed to like the skeleton as opposed to the body.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? It becomes like that kind of rooting system, you know?
And within both of that, you're taking this language of leisure and this language of rest and turning it from an inactive bodily rendering to then an active bodily rendering. I would love for you to talk about why that switch, why that change, and also how that relates to this notion of the interior still being in an expansive place.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Look at you. That's like such a good question. I love that question. You know, it's a beautiful question because my answer is the most complicated and simple. Like part of it is like I got a dog, and so it was like I was hiking a bunch. Like I was just like out in the wilderness in the woods a lot, But one of the things that I do is that I listen to an audiobook, or I'm listening to a lecture, and I'm listening to ideas, and these voices become like companions for me. And, I think about like this idea of, in earlier works, I thought about this idea of the shadow self, the idea of there was a version of you that is an amalgamation of all the past attributes you attributed, right? You have then like grown out of that self. And so the reason I bring that up is because I think about the interior landscape as being occupied by an amalgamation of different selves, right? Like the child that you were, the person you are today, but the individual or the subject, or in Mary Oliver's word, the governor of that third space, meaning the space of creativity, that space of wonder. And if that's the case, for her, she thought about this idea that the things that drive our creative landscape, or that drive our curiosity, or kind of ignite that sense of wonder, that it was occasional in many of us, right? Because of what life does to you. Like, the older you get, you don't have as much time and as much space to dwell on such, kind of like waxy poetic musings, you know what I mean? To appreciate the poetry that the sky brings to you, or that the poetry of a landscape or the night sky brings to you. But there is a self inside of you that does appreciate those things, that is, not compromised by the external pressures of the world we live in. And so for me, I started thinking about what types of things nourish that third self. Because for me, it is most definitely a tyrant. Like, it's active all the time. Like, I'm in my head, in my studio, thinking about these things often. And many of my ideas come through walking, they come through making, they come through me just being in a space, And as a child, like, I found so many voices and points of guidance in books, in literature, and in writing, or in teachers. But like, the thing that inspires me now is like the outdoors, the nature, but also all of you. Like, people who share ideas, people who are invested in ideas, fascinate me. I want to talk to them, and I'm curious about like, what does my inner landscape say to theirs? Does it provoke them or not? Does it provoke their sense of wonder? Does it provoke a sense of curiosity? And how is it that we discuss those particular curiosities or concerns around an art object, or around certain types of things that are intangible, so to speak? And so I think to the first part of it, yes, like hiking and spending time in the landscape. I was taking a train here from New Haven, because I live in Connecticut, y'all. So I took the train down, and I was looking, and it was amazing because we witnessed what today looks like. For many of you, you're like, it's a cloudy day, it's gray outside, there's no sun. But there's another word for it. You can just call it a silver day. And I was on the train, and I remember looking out the window, and I was like, wow, there's like a silver sky laying above a sea of wheat. And so there was like this kind of like lush brown landscape outside of my window on the train that's not all that exciting. But that's the type of poetry that's, available to you at any point of time if you just pay attention, right? And so I try to start there in a lot of ways, just like really attentive looking at things, yeah.
And it's interesting because that attentive looking is not necessarily yearning for a world that is not compromised, but it's the access of it within.
Yeah, the world that's simply here,
exactly,
right? It's like,
yeah.
It's simply what we have. Mm-hmm. It's like, people are oftentimes so disappointed at the way I tend to describe my work, because it's overly romantic, and sometimes, or it seems to be overly invested in these things that don't immediately impact the external world, right? Like this idea of leisure. And my issue with that is that it speaks volumes to like, this kind of impoverished definition to life, to me, that we all have, right? If you live your life with the assumption that like your external life is completely divorced from your internal one, that's why you end up with problems. Like that's a very complicated space to start from, right? In the sense that the type of work you do have to do is the kind of nurturing of one's interior landscape, right? Like recognize that as any type of community. Like I think about like the kite as an object, right? Like it's an object that was born and designed by the Chinese, right? With an original utility that was intended for, military, usage, meaning to like send messages into their camps and to drop off ammunition, to drop off food and packages, right? But we recognize that like this idea of objects that fly seems to be of consequence to another community. And over time, our relationship to said object becomes one that we all celebrate, because our relationship to it changes over time, and our relationship to like the idea of a flying object changes over time, and what we can imagine it to be. And so I would say for me, I try to start there in terms of just like a really critical but unassuming observation,
Mm-hmm. Which also relates to your earlier notions on time and temporality, that the slowness is as available to you as the quickness is, that the reception and sinking into one's body, and existing with the wherewithal, the passion that Mary Oliver is describing is always available to us.
Yeah, but I mean also, writers like Tracy K. Smith.
Exactly,
Like I think about that painting, I was just talking to a good friend of mine in the audience today about the painting, The Weather in Space. And so I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with Tracy K. Smith's writing, but I strongly suggest you become quickly acquainted with it because her voice is like quite powerful and one that I think that we all should respond to and at least seek out. And so I have a painting that I produced called The Weather in Space, and it's borrowed from a title of one of her poems in the book, Life on Mars. But the opening lines of the poem is God the wind or what commands it? And I love that, right? So it's the idea of slowing down and having space to contemplate certain ideas of that, of that measure. Meaning that, as I was talking to my friend, like the idea of like the wind being something that you seek out on a hot summer day, like a nice breath of fresh air. But it also could be a devastating hurricane that is, outside of your realm of possibilities or scope of understanding. And then we think about this idea of like measuring this immaterial thing, this abstract thing, this deity, a certain type of intellectual activity to a natural force, right? So we have, again, like a scene of kites flying against the wind, this unnatural force, right? Things that we are trying to make sense out of, even on a poetic scale. And for her, it was this idea that like, both, it could be, quite natural, but it also could be like quite devastating, quite harmful. But the idea that, whether it be a prayer or the idea of kite flying or the idea of reading, that there's something that is required in order for you to engage with it, and that's like a surrender, right? You have to surrender yourself to that particular phenomenon. And I think about painting that same way. It's like, you're only as skilled as you think you are, but if you're in your studio at 2 a.m., are you really that good? It's like, that really is what it comes down to. It's like, you might not be that good, bro. You might have to surrender, and that's important. Like, I think that's important, right? So again, surrender to like the process of just letting your painting be the painting. Yeah. And I had that same attitude about The Weather in Space. I had so many, impulses to change it. But, you surrender a bit. And you surrender yourself to like the force of just like what it is that the work is telling you, what the work is saying, what the work is communicating. Yeah.
I want to get into color. Because we are surrounded by color currently, but also thinking about our entry into the space, we entered into the gallery that was deeper in value and color. And I've heard you say elsewhere that color is a mechanism through which magic can exist for the Black subject. And I love that. And I want to talk about the magic of Black as a color, as a mechanism, and as a value. Because when you enter into the first gallery, you see this formality that you've created through the negotiation of value, the negotiation of hue in the color Black. And we were talking earlier, and I would love for you to speak more about this, how you're able to negotiate still having light in a painting, and negotiate one's body around a work that requires of an entirely Black painting.
Yeah, I think, I live in New Haven, right? And we have the Yale Center for British Art, and I remember Hilton Knowles came, and I don't know if y'all know Hilton Knowles' writing, but he's a fucking brilliant essayist. You should read his work. You should read his work on like art criticism, theater criticism. He's fantastic. But anyway, he once had a quote when he was reading an introduction for Lynette Yiadom-Boakye, when he was describing her work at the Yale Center for British Art. And in doing so, he talked about this idea in the context of James Baldwin and his relation to the idea of the color Black, meaning that if Black wasn't a color, if that was the case, you wouldn't be able to see the color Black. Meaning that there is, someone's lying. It's like, if Black is really the absence of light, you truly would not be able to see the thing. And if I was to think about it in that context, the best example I can think about this, and this will lead into how I think about the color Black, because I think about the color Black in this, both poetically, but a highly academic way too, because I'm also a student of color theory. And so if we were to think about an artist like Kerry James Marshall, it breaks my heart whenever I think about like young painters who are engaging with representations of Black figures that are hyper Black, meaning that they're using Black most likely out of the tube, like an Ivory Black, a Mars Black, a Bone Black, a Lamp Black. All of these 4 different Blacks, right? And they just use them out of the tube and they apply a white to them. And what they're doing is that they're not changing the color black, they're just simply dampening it down into a particular range that's like malleable for dimension. Now, if we were thinking about someone like Kerry James Marshall and how he thinks about the color black, or even like certain shows in pop culture, like something like produced by Issa Rae, like Insecure, whenever she thinks about like black bodies in the club, they're lit a certain type of way. And so if you were to look at a Kerry James Marshall painting, you're looking at black in terms of values. And so you may have a warm black and a cool black. And understanding the language of those colors is very important when you're thinking about how to create a monochromatic black painting that's not only powerful, but it's also sophisticated. Because I know that you're not relying on value shifts in titanium whites and zinc whites, right? Like you're understanding that black in and of itself, just like this yellow, this red, and this blue here, is a spectrum. Yellow could be in and of itself a warm color and a cool color. So can reds, you have cool reds, you have warm reds, you have neutral reds, likewise with blue. So all of these things are assumptions that we're just taking for granted. And we don't apply these assumptions to a color like black. Nor white, really, if you're thinking about just like the pigmentation of the color. And so for me, when it came to creating that painting that is the most monochromatic color, painting in the room, which is called Shadow Hour, I should first explain to you why I decided to make like a black playground painting. And so there was a time where I had to, it really was a privilege to see a playground under conditions that most of us may be unfamiliar with. So I imagine most of you who go to a playground at a park, it exists within a landscape, and you're probably there in the afternoon, maybe the morning, early evenings, but you're there when the sun is out. So you're understanding where you are, the landscape you are, everything is contextualized. I had the experience of being able to witness that playground under conditions that weren't always as common. Meaning I got to see it at night. Now I got to see the poetics of what the change in day got to offer to me for a particular object. And so out of respect for that memory and out of respect for that kind of encounter, because I remember as a kid, like seeing that shit and being just totally blown, like my mind was blown as like an 11-year-old and being like just so astounded that this thing that I was so familiar with, I wasn't. I was actually wrong with what it was that I thought I saw, And so when it came to understanding how I wanted to represent that, I understood the way that nighttime affects structural objects. Meaning that the structure of a playground had a different type of life. It may be like a cool black, right? Because it's a metallic object, it's a black object. And the environments around it may be warm, which means you may add like a titanium buff to it or a cadmium yellow. You'll situate them into things that are quite familiar. Cool objects probably wouldn't be the most, or cool blacks wouldn't be the most effective way for me to do that. But as I was talking to you about that black painting, what's crazy about paints, y'all, is that even when you paint them, they don't ever stay the same. And so this is what's crazy about making these things. So I tend to make like 3 or 4 studies for all these paintings because like color and paint, it's a changeling. Like the shit messes with you. Like you'll put 2 colors next to each other and like one will like get either really depressed and become like really neutral, or one might get really excited. And then next thing you got a problem on your hands because like these colors like now talking to each other and they're becoming very, very vibrant. You don't want that if you're trying to work in a really tight, a minimalist palette, so to speak. And that's one of the concerns I had to be very intentional to when I made that black one, to keep the range, concise. And then if we were to think about the black walls of all those paintings, it was because what that black playground painting is doing what in painting, for those people who do paint here, it's called sinking in. And so when an oil painting sinks in, it means that some of the pigmentation and luminosity and the initial paint layer that you lay down gets sucked into the canvas or into the ground that the painting is now being applied on top of. And so a lot of those grays that you see in those paintings are things that allow that playground to become legible. That is not what it looks like in my studio initially. Like in my studio, that painting was probably closer to that wall's color, And so then it becomes this idea of like how the painting in its painting life, meaning that how the painting functions on the surface, responds to the environment in which it's hung. And so I thought that would be a great way to play with that stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we talked in your studio in a totally different idea about Richard Mayhew and the colors of Mayhew and how that influenced you.
Yeah.
And so Mayhew, amongst many other things, he creates works in which he attributes color to emotion. So what is the color of love? What is the color of desire? What is the color of fear? And when I turn those questions to your work, I think of what is the color of rest? What is the color of play? What is the color of leisure? Mm-hmm. And so I would love to hear you talk about how you attribute color to a particular scene or landscape or activity.
I love that. It's so funny, 'cause, man, damn, I thought I knew so much about him. I guess I was wrong. Oh, well. Yeah, it's funny, because like when I love Richard Mayhew's work, like I think he's a brilliant painter. But when I look at those paintings, I think I want to respond to like the language of color, right? So when I'm making a painting, I don't necessarily assign like an emotion or a sensation or a feeling to it, like love or desire or anything like that. Like, I'm very, very excited about this painting conversations, right? And that's what attracts me to Richard Mayhew's work. Because if you're looking at a Richard Mayhew painting, if you're looking at it and you're like, oh, okay, it's like a painting that has a relationship to impressionist aesthetics that are done by a Black indigenous artist that is intended to be a representation of the thing that he saw, then you probably be wrong, in my opinion. And it's because if you were to look at a Richard Mayhew painting, and if you were to look at them and you simply say, it's a landscape with a bush in it, or a landscape and a bush and a collection of trees, then I'm like, that's kind of like a very surface level of engagement with that work, right? Because what you're really looking at, one, is not a representation of, one is not nature itself, it's a representation of nature, meaning because it's a fucking painting. It's a painting, right? So we're looking at it as a painting. It's like, that's what it is. And so if you were to look at those things, then the distinction I love between Richard Mayhew and the Impressionists is that for Impressionist painters, there was this negotiation between exterior and interior, meaning that they would go outside and they would paint from life. They would paint the life and the poetry that they were able to consume in real time. And because you only have so many hours in a day, you take the painting back inside your room and you try to, recall what you saw, or at least respond to what's on the image. And then you go out and, revise and reverse and keep going. But for Richard Mayhew, he didn't do that. Like, when you're looking at that work, you're looking at how he describes his relation to desire, or his relation to appreciation, or a type of admiration, or an honoring, right? Yeah, of that environment. And so, but he does it through color. So what you're looking at truly is just the language of color. That if you would describe a bush, like in a space, it's not a bush. It's probably like a big blob of paint, of blues, that is described or intended to look like a bush, right? Or to represent a bush. In a landscape that makes no sense. And the landscape, if you're looking at it, it's not occupied by any of us. It's not occupied by anything that will lead you to believe that a human touched it, outside of the fact that it's an art object. But the environments are completely serene. They're impeccably painted. They're carefully and methodically planned out when it comes to like their color relationships. Like, if you're observing it through the language of painting, you understand those paintings are not only an admiration of the landscape that they're a representation of, but they're an admiration of what painting can do in a way to commemorate what it is that we see, right? Like, that to me is like fucking exciting. Like, I think like that's so fun. I'm not interested in him painting bushes. I'm interested in how he uses a mark. I'm interested in how he's describing that bush. Like, what is you see? Why does it need to look like that? Why is it important that it seems as though these spaces are not touched by human hands? Why are they so pristine? Why is nothing grayed out? They're all very lush. And so there's this appreciation to like the poetry of color and the luminosity of color that he's in, And so when I thought about that, I was like, damn, like, how do I get there? Like, how do you get into a Richard Mayhew landscape? It seemed like, if I got there, I probably would. I was in that space. But then I started thinking about what does get you there? And so leave room for the wind. In a lot of ways, the palette of that painting responds to a Richard Mayhew painting that I have in my studio. I don't want it. Was I holding this the entire time? Oh, my bad, y'all. Damn, that's so embarrassing. Okay. I don't know where I was, but yeah, so that painting.
Of the Richard Mayhew paints, how that shows up in your studio and actually in your practice.
Oh yeah, I was just trying to figure out a way to get you there, and it seems like, if I'm someone who's interested in, do I need to hold this? If I'm someone who's interested in the idea of a transformative act and you get there through an activity such as like painting or fucking kite flying or community-driven activities, then that for me is that's the vehicle, right? It's the medium, it's the avatar. It's the thing that ferries you into that landscape, right? Because I think about his paintings as contracts. There's a requirement in order for you to get to that space that he's observing, right? And I think for him, again, this is totally like assumption. Like, I've not spoken to this man at all. But I think for him, a lot of it comes from his indigenous roots, right? The idea of witnessing the land as something, sacred, and witnessing that our participation with it does come with a cost, and describing that through the language of painting. For him, like for me and my love for painting, is where the magic happens, And so, yeah, I will start there with it.
Thank you. I want to ensure that we leave time for questions from the audience. So if you have questions, please let us know. Raise your hand and we'll come around to you.
Yeah.
I was just curious about, you said that the departure point was poetry and text, and I was curious about your relationship, because you're an image maker, right? Mm-hmm. And this is text, and the relationship between text and image. And I was thinking about the fact that when you talked about physical, the body versus the painting, I was thinking about Jacques Derrida, with his, the philosopher, with his deconstruction theory, where he says that language has a body and it floats. And then you're making, I was wondering about that. What do you think about this relationship between text and image, text and color? Because I see a lot of poetry in the painting, the rhythm, the movement, the stillness versus the movement. And another thing that I wanted to ask you is, once you are painting in such a huge scale, I mean, it's very different than, doing a small work. I assume you paint and then you go backwards to it. And then you come, there is this constant movement in and out, right? Mm-hmm. And then I think, when I think about it, I forgot the word. I'm curious again about, does it make you more like constantly critical of what you're doing? Like, does it interrupt in the process that you constantly have to get this perspective?
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm so much more clear. Okay. Let's see. I don't feel like my ideas, like the way I think about things, get in my way. I have an overactive imagination anyway. And so if you were to like hang out with me on like a Tuesday, like it'd be a trip, just like wondering like what's going on in my head. And so, I mean, I've always just been this way. I don't know how not to do it. It's just in terms of like the way my brain functions and the way I consume things. But I like the idea and your observation around like my relationship to like language and poetry and being an image maker. And, I think what's important, and I want to make sure that everyone's very, very clear on this, is that I'm not reading things and then making a one-to-one relationship between the thing that I'm reading and the image. Like, they're not illustrations of the text. None of what Mary Oliver has written about has anything to do with kite flying, like whatsoever. Like, that's just not it. But I think about, and I mean, again, to quote her, I think this is very useful. It's like, I don't think about language or ideas as like a way to describe myself, right? I think about them as like landscapes or like arenas or environments I can play into. And that's how I think about it in painting. Like the painter René Magritte once said that the role of painting is to make poetry visible, right? And again, if we were to think about what I said earlier when I initiated the conversation, it was about the idea that what Mary Oliver and I have in common is this passion for looking, right? And you take this idea of attentive looking, or what some painters or artists consider to be witnessing an art object, right? And I think about these things in that language, or I'm fascinated by that language. I don't think about the idea of encountering an art object as witnessing, but others do. Like, if you were to consider someone like Rashid Johnson, for example, he describes it in such a way. And he does it with the expectation that linguistic distinction matters. That when one is a witness to something, you recall it, right? Because that's what you are as a witness. Recall what it was that you see or saw. What did you encounter? And what Mary Oliver and I both deeply appreciate is simply observing the world around you passionately. And it's not so much that, I'm walking in the woods, I'm thinking about her, and I'm like, all these things. But I'm also thinking about people like Jenée, or my friend Flora, or people who I've managed to have like discourse with. And I'm thinking about that idea because, our role as image makers for me is to be in conversation. You make it to have dialogue. And so for me, I was like, I found a voice that could be a shadow companion on this particular thing. There's someone I can be in dialogue with, because I'm not, artists, again, we're very solitary creatures. I'm not talking to like my friends who are working their jobs about these ideas that are in my head, right? Like I'm talking to writers, or I'm talking to painters, or like I'm going through Alex Katz's retrospective at the Guggenheim just because I'm curious about how he's thinking about his work, and those become the vehicles for how I build bridges around ideas. Yeah, but they're all mine, like in terms of how I think about things. It's just less lonely when you're not working in isolation that way. Yeah.
Another question. All right.
Hi.
I heard while you were talking, you listen to audiobooks as you're hiking. However, I guess I want to know about your process, like how you're stimulating yourself. I don't know, auditorily, while you're painting, are you listening to audiobooks? Do you? And I also have like a strange thought, because I also do a similar thing. Do you read like a passage from that specific book to yourself and then play it back over and over again as you're painting? It was similar thing. Not while painting, but I just want to know what you listen to while you're painting, if it helps your artistic process.
Man, if you were in my studio, it's a party. It's like, my studio's popping. Like, I'm listening to a lot of great stuff, yeah. I listen to lectures from time to time, but also it's like, when you're in your studio and you're working, sometimes artists are just having a good time. So I could be playing anything from this band that I'm really into called Rainbow Kitten Surprise, or RKS, who I love. Like, I think they're fucking fantastic. I think they're so good. They're so talented. But I also could be listening to like Smokey Robinson or Metro Boomin, or anyone who's making something that I find fascinating or good. I just like good music. And I have a profound respect for musicians. And I mean that sincerely. I think that as a practitioner, as a person who's to get into like such a rich history like that is outstanding, right? And to make something exciting. But yeah, I'm also kind of a nerd, man. Like it helps like to feel like you're in school again. Like, 'cause I think if you're dealing with ideas that you feel insecure about, so to speak, in terms of like how do you share them with people or your community, it helps to understand that you are not in fresh territory, and so that's what it comes down to when I think about reading. If I'm thinking about these ideas, because in your mind, man, I'm a fucking genius. Like I'm thinking about all this stuff. You're not though, right? Like you're actually not. Like there are people who have been invested, and this is again goes back to like my earlier work. If I thought about like someone like James Baldwin or W.B. Du Bois, like I found them fascinating along with surrealist writers like Marquez or Borges because of their use of language in a very particular way. And so for me, when it came down to like poets, I started to hear them like in these audiobooks describe like certain phenomena. Mind you, they use their own particular language for it, right? For John O'Donohue, it was like the inner landscape. For Mary Oliver, it was the summoning world. For someone like Sarah Lewis, she calls it the private domain. And then I started to respond to these echoes, right? And these, I'm like, okay, shit, I'm not crazy. Like people are talking, this shit, it exists.
It's a shared language.
It's a shared language.
Yeah.
I love that. It's a shared language. Say it again. Have fun. Yeah, right. But it's beautiful, right? Because it's a language that we can all collectively participate with, right? Like, and it doesn't have to be verbatim. It could be described in any way that you want. And I recognize it, right? I identify it as something that is of kinship to something I'm concerned with,
Because it's a multiplicity of perspective.
Yeah. What's up, y'all? All right, we'll go with the hat and then you. How you doing?
I'm great. I'm Gabby. Nice to meet you.
A pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, and so, quick question. I'm someone who really just values just the idea of staying connected to playfulness, staying connected to just overall sense. And through what I'm witnessing, I feel that immensely through your work, and I'm really curious around how you yourself stay connected to your sense of play, and how do you bring yourself back to playfulness in times where it's inaccessible.
Oh my! I don't know if I'm feeling that as much these days. I'm kidding, but I was like, get a dog. I was like, that is by far the best thing you can probably do for yourself. Because what's great about them is that I watch and observe my dog because I'm a dog parent, And this is like not on some kumbaya shit, but I think it really comes down to like the idea, truly, because like what I'm about to say like matters, It's not like overly romantic and frivolous, but I think what you said is quite important, right? Because, I think when I watch my dog, she proves a point, like that it really is all here for you. Right, that all the other things that stress us out are all fabricated. It's fucking made up. Like this is totally extraneous. Like my dog gets along just fine, like it's just like just fine. I mean, it's not that I'm taking care of her every need or anything like that, right? But again, so the idea of one, decentering the self, right, engaging with things that help you understand, like, I live in a world and these things are quite frankly made up, and it's okay to be goofy. Like my dog doesn't give a shit who's watching her. Like she's like totally confident. And mind you, have to be a dog person. You're a cat. It can be whatever you want. It can be a hamster. Why would you have a hamster? I don't know. But like, sure. But I also think it's important, when it comes down to this idea of play, is to also like consume some comedy. I think comedians are really powerful, like not only orators, but are also fantastic descriptors of our time, right? As vehicles, right? We understand their role for us. And so I will say that's, like those two, like I need to laugh and I need to see things to help me kind of like, I'm kind of a high-strung and stressful person, so I need to like have my, equilibrium balanced out a bit more. But yeah, I will say, and it might be hard for me to answer this honestly because I'm just a goofy guy. Like I think like I'm also intrinsically kind of this way, And I try to like give that to people who I feel like are struggling a bit with it, I'm sorry, it may not be a good answer, but it's honest. What's your question?
Thank you both for that incredible talk and for this incredible work, Dominic. I have a question about some of the forms of the kites. They take on the forms of aquatic beings, and I wondered if there was something thematic about that, or if you could speak to that.
Like that thing?
And in some of the other works.
Oh, like the jellyfish?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if that you said magical realism earlier, so I wonder if you spoke to that.
Oh, no, it totally does. But I think the idea of kite flying is a fantastic way to kind of provoke a sense of magic, Like when I first started thinking about the idea of using the kites, like they came from this space, or a memory really, when I saw kites in St. Louis on this place called Art Hill. And in our, it's like our Central Park, and not as big as y'all's are, but we're pretty proud of it. We're pretty proud of what we have. And so I remember just thinking about the kites as being like these kinds of vehicles to alert to my imagination that something was happening, right? It just, they called to me as a child, and I just never forget feeling that sense of provocation, And so that for me became really important to kind of tease out with this work. But when it comes to the fish, the little clownfish, and I don't know what kind of fish he is, but it's a fish. And those are jellyfish up there, of course. But that came from this idea of the poetry of the image, right? Like fish never are above your heads. But what's sick is that if you got to see clouds reflected on the water, if you got to see clouds on the water, and then you can see this fish at the surface level moving through that, through kite flying, you can make that real. That's what's dope about magical realism, and that's what's dope about artwork, right? Paintings or any type of artwork is that they can present to the world ideas that would never really work, but we get to experience them nonetheless. You know what I mean? I think that's quite beautiful. I was talking to the students from the Hill Art Foundation. Okay. It's okay. I was waiting on that. There's never just one. But so I was talking to these kids at the Hill Arts Foundation, right? And one of the students asked me a very similar question. And she was like, why are these, jellyfish and these fish in the sky? And it was simply they don't belong there. They just don't. But in the world of painting, they can be, right? And if you understand what a cloudscape is in a lot of ways, it's just, an atmosphere of moisture, that air and hydrogen gets caught up in. And so in a lot of ways, it could function as its kind of aquatic environment, if you were to think about it in that context. So that's why I try to breathe poetry into these things by just staring at them why is that thing up there? When I made Rosalind, I just wanted her to be different from Isadora, because the impetus for this painting and its idea was I just wanted to think about what would it be like for a rainbow to explode, because I was making a lot of paintings of the rainbow and the shadow work. And if you think about this thing in the sky, and if in magical terms, you could blow it up, because a lot of things are blowing up right now. So if we could blow it up, then what would it look like? It would probably look like this thing standing right behind me, this kind of eruption of color, you know? And so that's kind of like where the poetry and just like these types of phenomena kind of occur to me, you know?
Maybe one last question.
Hi.
Paulina, I want to say that I really love your paintings, and I think that they have a lot of emotion. And what I was curious about, even some of the paintings where you use darker colors, dark blues, dark red, that could be quite ominous or depressive colors, they still have a very optimistic feel. And you alluded to it a bit when you were talking about your black painting. How do you prevent those paintings from feeling heavy and preserving that playfulness and that imagination despite using those dark colors?
That might just be a me thing, 'cause, man, they look bright as hell in my studio. So I'm like, yo, that's what, in my studio, for real, it honestly like me thing. Like, this thing in my studio looks bright as, maybe it might be the lighting here. So, I mean, you know, what I tend to think about it is that a lot of these paintings, if you were to look at them, they have a relationship to certain art historical models. Like both this painting, Rosalind, Leave Room for the Wind, and Isadora all respond in a lot of ways to like Richard Mayhew paintings. Like if you were to look at his like colorscapes, like almost like you'd be like, all right, I can see who he's looking at, what he's thinking about, or the idea that you could expand that landscape or that kind of like color vocabulary in a way. And so I don't know if like maybe do you think my paintings are moody?
No, I don't. I find them very uplifting, but based on
The color's
I
moody.
expect them to be more sad, but when I look at them, they feel very optimistic and happy, but it's unexpected based on the color palette.
I think I am a Gemini. You know, so there might be a reason for that. You know what I mean? Because again, I think like I appreciate the observation, and I mean that sincerely. I think that for myself is that it's the question and the observation that you're having is not one that I'm not unfamiliar with. Like I've heard it quite a few times. Like there's a particular mood to them, right? In the sense that like their visual language, the aesthetic of them. I think that might be a product of, and I mean, I don't want to lie to you. I fucking hate when painters lie. Like, it really might just be a response to like how I'm thinking about what's in front of me. You know, I try to be very careful of like my ego in my paintings, so it doesn't work out all the time. You know, like when I applied to grad school, I applied because I was a shitty painter. It's like I'm not like, you know, I wasn't a good painter whatsoever. And so if I was to have students, I would try to explain this to them as well. It's like so much of what you're saying there, man, you have to distinguish between whether or not that's what the painting is communicating to you and when it's your ego. Like it might just be like, yo, that painting, for example, The Weather in Space, was totally legitimate on its own terms, right? For the painting to just be a pink landscape. Because it fulfilled all my requirements. Like it was a meditation of what life would look like on Mars, where stars and snowflakes could be pretty much the same shit. But I wanted to put a house in there. I was like, I'm gonna put a house in here. I'm gonna put like a fucking golden dog rolling through the space. Imagine if I did some shit like that. Like, you know, so a lot of it is, as a painter, your responsibility to just respond very acutely and attentively to what's in front of you. You know, and that to me is, and knowing when to just stop. Like my teachers always tell me, like, keep your eyes open, man. Like, cause this shit, like the hubris will mess you up because you're not respecting your medium. And so I can't speak to the kind of like mood. You might just have to chunk it up to, I'm a moody guy. Like, I mean, that might be a part of it.
But I also feel like you are finding, you're able to create an expanse in visual language because you're creating space within one color.
I like that.
You're creating almost a rainbow within one color. And so you still get the depth in figure, you get the depth in light, you get that range that qualifies to good painting because you're able to still find expanse within restriction.
Yeah, well, I'm just interested also, you know, building up that conversation too. Like when I created Rosalind, that violet at the bottom of those hills there, like that was a decision I made in response to that golden kite that's near the figure in the blue. You know, that is, yeah, so because if you know what color theory is, like gold and purple are complementary colors. And so it felt like a good way to like break down, and also like that ground that looks as though it's like maybe a green or whatever. And I cannot prove this, but if you were in my studio and you were to see what that color looked like on my palette, it was a very luminous yellow. it wasn't as green as it looks there, but it's responding to all that visual information in the ground. And so you'll notice, like, not only is that purple, that violetish blue holding that edge, but also you'll look underneath it and it's existing on like a kind of saturated pink, a strawberry pink, right? And so much of that happens just when you're working. Like, I'm not even thinking about like, how is this gonna look or whatever. I know what I need to have them talk. Like, I know what's gonna get those colors talking to each other, right? And that is just like formal stuff. You know, a lot of it isn't like as poetic or as thought out as like my conscious mind is. A lot of it's just like my muscles as a painter. It's just like, you gotta get some of this stuff like out of your head and just like, you go back to the basic, like academic training, man. Like, how do you get this stuff to work? So yeah. Okay. Sorry, y'all.